Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Chapter 9. Unlimited Power. The next morning, Izuku found an unforeseen flaw in setting up camp in a stairwell when he woke up to the sounds of screams echoing off the vaulted ceilings. It was not the first time he had woken up to a nightmare since he moved, but it was the first time he woke up screaming. He was tangled in his blanket, and the cold sweat that coated his skin just made the fabric cling even closer. He was pinned down in a pitch-black echo chamber of his own screams. It was hell. He finally thrashed himself out of the confines of his blanket, and his hands met with the rough concrete floor. Blindly reaching out, he felt the wall and the cool metal of the handrail. The shock of cold was enough to remind him where he was and realize he was the one screaming. The sound cut off as he gasped in a breath. It was just a dream, but his overactive imagination had him feeling the phantom burn of fire and explosions where scars marred his flesh. It seemed his subconscious took it upon itself to remind him of his weakness in response to the hope burning in his chest that refused to die. Distantly, he registered that tears were streaming down his cheeks, and every breath felt like it was tearing his lungs apart, but the sensations were too far away. The brief, grounding moment the handrail provided had come and gone. He knew there was no reason to panic. There was no danger, but he couldn't get the message to his body. Forcing himself to push through the disconnect, he bundled himself in his comforter and backed against the wall as his shaky hands went to flick on the flashlight. The oppressive darkness wasn't doing much to calm his nerves. Once he proved to himself nothing was lurking in the shadows, he rested his head on his knees and tried to calm his breathing. Just a dream. It was just a dream. Breathe in for 4 counts. Hold for 4 counts. Out for 4 counts. Hold for 4 counts. Rinse and repeat. He didn't know how long he sat there trying to regulate his breathing, but by the time he got a hold of himself, the time read 5:24 a.m. He had a little less than an hour before his alarm was set to go off, but there was no way he was going to be able to go back to sleep. It was Tuesday, so it was a shower day, and there was no way he could skip it, since he skipped the last one to research first aid at the library, and then spent the whole weekend sifting through trash at Dagobah. He smelled like trash, and the cold sweat from the nightmare wasn't helping. He picked up the knife from the last step of the upper stairs, where he'd put it last night. The gun was on the last step of the lower stairs, as far out of sight and reach as it could be. It was a nice knife. It had a leather-wrapped handle that fit well in his grip, and it was much more reasonably sized than the kitchen knife. The blade was up to 4 to 5 inches long. It was balanced well at the guard, with the hilt being about the same length as the blade. It felt good in his hand. It felt right. His body was still buzzing with energy, so he decided to run through his drills with the new knife. Despite his hands still shaking, the movements felt more fluid. Izuku supposed that made sense. A clunky, unbalanced blade made his movements feel clunky and unbalanced. But this knife was elegant. He wouldn't go so far as to call his movements elegant, but they felt right. Lost in his own movements, he was shocked when he heard his alarm go off. He'd been dancing around with a knife for 45 minutes, like an idiot. Unfortunately, he couldn't bring a knife to school, so he mournfully set it aside and slipped his soap into his bag. He had run out of shampoo a few weeks ago, and he'd been washing his hair with bar soap. His curls were in a sad state, but it wasn't a priority, so he just had to make do. They were also starting to hang in his eyes, but he couldn't afford a haircut, and he didn't trust himself to do anything but make it worse if he tried to do it himself. The bullies already had enough ammunition. He didn't need to fuel the fire by giving himself an absolute hack job haircut. He had wanted to grow it out when he was younger, but his parents always said he looked like a girl and dragged him to the barber shop. As annoying as it was now, it felt like an act of rebellion, and soon he would be able to tuck it behind his ear. For now, he would soldier through getting his nose tickled while he was working. The route to school took Izuku past the former cafe he got attempted mugged behind last night. It was surreal. It felt like that experience had happened to someone else. It just felt like there was no way Izuku disarmed and scared off a mugger. It seemed even more impossible that gangly little Izuku dropped a mountain of a man like a sack of potatoes last week. But he did, and he was here to, well, he didn't have anyone to tell the tale to, but the point was, he could. He had gotten out of those fights relatively unscathed, and he couldn't seem to process that. He had been weak and useless his whole life, and the person who did those things was incongruent to what Izuku had always been. He couldn't be strong. He couldn't fight. He couldn't help people. He couldn't be a hero. But the person last night, they were clever and fast. They knew how to take control of the situation. The person last night was brave and skilled. They were strong. They were the antithesis of Izuku. It was confusing. He felt like he was trying to jam two puzzle pieces together that didn't fit. He was Deku, and Deku meant useless, but that other person wasn't useless. Izuku wanted to be that person more than anything. They just felt so out of reach. Izuku had been trying to repair the busted solar generator he found at Dagobah Beach for nearly a full month, but there was only so much he could do when the only tool he owned was a rusty screwdriver. He had managed to take it apart, but it had severe water damage, and he was pretty sure the main circuit board needed resoldering in several places, and the fuses were all blown. The problem with that was he didn't have a soldering iron, and even if he did, he didn't have anywhere to plug it in. He had been looking for replacement parts in the other abandoned electronics at Dagobah, but everything there had so much water damage, he had yet to find anything even remotely functional. The fuses were beyond repair and definitely needed replacing, but he thought the circuitry might not be too far gone. Maybe he should just look into how much the replacement parts would cost new. He didn't have much money, but getting this thing up and running would be such a huge quality of life improvement that, depending on the price, it would be worth cutting his losses. It was mid-September now, and he'd found a space heater at the dump that he thinks he fixed, but he didn't have anywhere to plug it in to test it. Being underground wasn't retaining heat as much as he had hoped it would, and it was only going to get worse as winter approached. Yeah, getting that generator fixed was becoming a priority. Replacement parts would have to be the next topic of research when he went to the library. Turns out, fuses aren't too expensive. It would only be about 1,500 yen. It made sense. They were made to break in order to protect the circuit from overflows in the electrical current. They were pawns to the circuit board king. Following that train of thought, it made sense that the circuit board itself would be much more expensive to replace. 20,000 yen was a lot of money for Izuku. Buying a soldering iron would only be 2,000 yen. If he could find somewhere to plug it in, he might be able to fix the circuit board himself. Possibly wasting 2,000 yen versus possibly saving 18,000 seemed worth the gamble, so Izuku took a mental note of where the nearest hardware store was before he headed to school. The next time Izuku went to visit DJ, short for Dumpster Jump Scare, he kept his eyes above the dumpster to see where she'd jumped out from. He had a feeling she spent all day sleeping in the sunshine up on the roof of the building. That's certainly what he would do if he was a cat, and if he got this generator up and running, he'd need to put the panel on the roof to optimize the amount of sunlight it captured. Leaving his flashlight on the windowsill all day might be enough to keep it going, but a whole generator would require much more power. He wouldn't necessarily be able to take the same path to the roof as DJ, but DJ was a huge cat, so whatever foothold she used would have to be sturdy enough for a 20 to 25-pound cat to launch herself off of daily. So as he encroached on her hunting grounds, he kept his eyes on the roof, and as he got closer, he saw her eyes peek over the ledge before she launched herself off and onto the dumpster in one leap. No fair! He couldn't do that. Well, that explains how you make such a racket every time you jump on that poor dumpster. You're reaching terminal velocity before you dent that lid every night, he grumbled. That may be a bit dramatic. There was no way she could reach terminal velocity from that height, but he was really hoping to get some help from this cat, who still steadfastly seemed to hate him despite him feeding her every night for weeks. You know, one day you're going to fall through that lid, and I'm going to laugh at you, he added as he tossed the nightly treats and went to leave. But just before he rounded the corner, he saw her jump down to the ground and sniff. Yes! She had been eating the treats this whole time, not the rats. She just didn't want to give Izuku the satisfaction of knowing she liked them. Cheeky little brat. Izuku had resigned to having to find his own way up to the roof as he curled himself into bed that night. Izuku had a plan. He'd found an extension cord that probably worked, and he was going to plug it into the outlet outside of the front of the mini-mart. It was probably for if the owner wanted to hang lights during the holidays, but they never did, and Izuku had seen people charging phones there before. The owner, Shimamoto-san, was a very kind man and never cut the power to that outlet or chased anyone off. He also heard through the grapevine that he would give away pastries at closing after they'd gotten too stale to sell, but Izuku had been avoiding staying out at night as much as possible, so he hadn't gotten the chance to see if that was true or not. So the plan was to run the extension cord around the back alley and try to fix the circuit board as quickly as possible. He didn't want people asking questions, and a 12-year-old attempting to fix circuitry in the middle of the street while mooching off the mini-mart's electricity was sure to draw attention. He dropped 5,000 yen on the fuses, soldering iron, and the accompanying tools like a tiny wire brush, some replacement wires, flux, and the actual solder itself. So he was really hoping it wouldn't be for nothing. Dragging the whole generator to the mini-mart back alley wasn't really the best idea, so he would have to hope he got everything right the first time so he wouldn't have to go back and forth to check if it was working a million times. He'd never done this before, but he'd done extensive research on the topic, and he was confident he had found what the issue was and would be able to fix it. If this didn't fix it, the thing may be too far gone, and Izuku was really hoping that wasn't the case. After practicing a few solder dots on the sidewalk, he brought out the circuit board that he had already disassembled and cleaned of the old busted wires and solder. Now there was nothing left to do but try his best. It only took 13 minutes for him to get all the wires in place and check his work about 1,000 times. Once he was sure that he'd done everything he could, he packed everything away and all but skipped back to the warehouse. He was so excited for this generator to work. It took him at least another half an hour to put all the pieces back together, and a further 5 minutes to pluck up the courage to flick the switch on. He finally steeled his nerves enough to flick the switch with his eyes squeezed shut, as if not seeing the moment he turned it on only to have it not work would save him the heartbreak. He peeked one eye open, and nothing. It wasn't working. He almost wanted to kick it down the stairs, and then he realized he was an idiot. It was a solar generator, and it had been broken for who knows how long, and then been sitting in a pitch-black stairwell for a month. Of course it wasn't working. With renewed vigor, He lugged the thing back up the stairs and on into the back alley. Hopefully DJ would scare away anyone who went poking around looking for hunks of junk to steal. He'd never heard the distinctive clang of her landing on the dumpster from inside the factory, but it was very loud. If it happened, he would hear it, so either dumpster jump scares were saved for him exclusively, or no one ever went into that back alley. The latter option seemed far more likely given how desolate the warehouse district was. Obviously, the alley wouldn't get the most sunlight, but Izuku hadn't found a way up to the roof yet, and he wasn't about to just leave it out in the open. It should be able to get enough exposure if he left it here while he was at school. It couldn't be cast in shadow all day, so at some point it would get direct sunlight. The next 19 or so hours were going to be the longest 19 or so hours of his entire life. He couldn't help but drag his feet as he made his way back to the stairwell to do his homework by flashlight light before he went to sleep. He was right. Forget everything else that had ever happened to him. Today was the worst day of his life. The anticipation was killing him. He would have ditched early if stepping a single toe out of line wouldn't have hell raining down on him from his teachers. His eyes were glued to the clock, and he was up and out of his seat within a nanosecond of the bell ringing. He was out of the classroom before the bell finished its toll, and he shot home in a dead sprint. All his experience in running was paying off. He cleared the 3.5-kilometer walk in record time and charged into the back alley, kicking up dust. He quickly knelt down in front of the generator. Come on. This was it. It's got to work. He flicked the switch, and the interface lit up. He had to curb his excitement. It was just the interface. That didn't mean it was fully operational. Whipping his backpack off his shoulder, he fished out his phone and phone charger and went to plug it in. This was it. The real moment of truth. His phone screen lit up with the notification. Charging. 43%. He couldn't help but scream and jump for joy. Yeah! Hell yes! Woohoo! He did it! He really did it! He had power again. All his hooping and hollering must have been enough to wake DJ, because he heard a meow from the roof where she sat glaring down at him. He'd have to leave her extra treats tonight as an apology for waking her.